Welcome to the 5th episode of Maester Monthly, your favorite pseudo-monthly podcast hosted by the moderators of the Song of Ice and Fire subreddit. Just as a heads up, this podcast is spoilers extended, which means it can include information from the Winds of Winter sample chapters and the Game of Thrones TV show. I am one of your hosts, Michael, also known as Bookshelfstud.
And I'm Eliana, Glass Table Girl.
And I'm Matt, also known as JoeMagician.
Hey, I'm back. Also back is Sam.
Yes, I'll do my best to bring that special spice from down under.
We are also joined by Jen Snow.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Snow, otherwise known as Jen. I wasn't very creative when coming up with my Reddit username, so it's been 5 years, it's going to stick.
Actually, yeah, between you and Sam, we have some very sort of on-the-nose usernames.
I think my hyphens differentiate me to a degree.
As always, we are going to talk about some of our favorite posts from the last month, some of the nicest catches, the hottest takes. We're also going to revisit the Unpopular Opinion Thunderdome once again and watch a wildly unpopular opinion duke it out with conflicting viewpoints. And finally, we'll talk about our sort of roundtable discussion, which is this month is going to be about Harrenhal. If you had to pick, if you guys had to pick any Westerosi warrior to be your champion in a tournament, who would it be? And you have a magical time machine by which you can pluck warriors from throughout Westerosi history.
Well, when we say Westerosi, I'm wondering if the lands of Always Winter count as Westeros because they're part of a landmass. Because I'd be mighty tempted to pick the Night's King. In case, because if it's a tourney and there's dead warriors from, a particularly violent round, he could, reanimate them, assist in the fight.
Savage. Sam the Slayer.
I feel like
Well, can they participate?
that'd be cheating, though. Yeah, you can't have your friends come and help you.
Well, I'm playing to win in this scenario.
I mean, maybe if it's a melee or something, and the people who fall in the melee rise up again.
I feel like that's a very risky bet, though, because we don't know. We've never actually seen the Night's King do anything other than raise people from the dead. And if that's null and void, your life's on the line.
Sam's dead. Sam's picking up his toys.
I think you need to risk it to win it.
It's fair enough.
A betting man.
Jen, who would you pick?
Hands down, Arthur Dane.
That's great.
How can you pick anybody else?
He's fun. I like him.
I almost feel like I'm cheating by going second and picking him.
It's hard to argue with that, though. I mean, he's got a magic sword. He's arguably the best fighter ever.
Dawn could probably have some adverse effect against an other or a white anyway, because doesn't it have... I know it's not Valyrian steel, but some magical property of harming the undead.
I mean, it glows. It's called Dawn. I mean, I would say that
so
against the Night's King, it'd be effective.
It nullifies my cheat anyway. It's a very good pick.
Well, I mean, don't count him out so quickly, because let's remember Howland Reed defeated Arthur Dane, so...
That's true.
If a Crannog man can do it, the Night's King probably has a fighting chance.
Yeah.
That fills me with hope.
It sure sounds like it.
I'm gonna have to go with the obvious answer here, and that's fire.
No,
It's 2 for 2.
Oh,
Fire is my champion.
You mean like Ares?
I choose fire.
Excuse me, Ares style.
Like why would I choose Arthur Dane or choose the Night's King when I could just choose fire?
I'm gonna have to sort of pick nits there real quick, because I did say Westerosi, and I'm not sure we can prove that fire is a Westerosi invention.
Well, it took place in proven trials by combat before,
That's
so
true.
That's true. It was a competitor.
Precedent's been set, man. What you gonna do about it?
Well, since Aaron took what I guess I would have picked as my champion, being a mad queen that I am, I will pick another queen that isn't really a queen. The queen who never was, Rhaenys Targaryen.
Oh.
Sure, she died and she lost in that one battle that we saw her in, but she was also obviously incredibly skilled with her weapon, a dragon, at 55 years old, and was so good fighting with it. She might have even been able to take on Vhagar, an enormous dragon from Aegon's conquest by herself if she hadn't been double teamed. So.
But aren't you really picking the dragon then?
Well, okay, the dragon on its own would definitely never be able to take on Vhagar, because, like, it really just takes the skilled hand of someone who knows what they're doing with a dragon.
All right, I accept it.
I'm sort of picturing like a monster truck rally poster for this tournament that we are describing, and it's just ridiculous at this point.
So I think what we're saying is we really don't want people to fight for us. We want it to be nature.
Exactly. If I could pick the children of the forest, I would.
I don't know if I'd want to have a child fight for me.
Maybe a magic child?
Yeah, right. Or hey, why not a giant at this point? I mean...
Matt, what about you?
All right, so for my champion, I would pick Simeon Stareyes.
Oh.
He's a legendary warrior from the Age of Heroes who had his eyes taken out and replaced them with sapphires. He had a long staff with blades at both ends and would spin it in his hands to chop down 2 men at once. So essentially, he's like a tornado of death. No shield, no sword, just kind of spins around killing everybody.
Like
He's got
Crash
the crazy-
Bandicoot?
Exactly, like Crash Bandicoot with a staff. It's great. And then he freaks out everybody with his sapphire eyes. They just keep watching the sapphires and they get killed. Anyways, if he's seeing things that are like otherworldly, that's the man you want on your side, because you don't know who you're fighting. What if somebody comes with like crazy supernatural beasts you've never seen of? Simeon Stareyes is seeing them.
Yeah, keep that in mind.
He sees everything. He kills everything with his crazy Bandicoot moves.
Or if his star eyes means that he's like a white or a White Walker, he's also icy dead people.
God.
Well, I was going to say something a little more measured and reasonable.
Whatever.
I was going to go with Lionel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm.
Oh, nice
Mostly
choice.
for the nickname. I feel like the nickname really gives him the edge he needs.
Well, if we're going in weather with ice and fire, storm, fits in pretty neatly.
There we go. You're right. Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
And dawn is...
I've got sword.
It's kind of a
Sword of the morning. It kind of fits.
Yeah.
Evoke the dragon.
very elemental.
We've got a good theme tournament going here.
What's that term? Like the invisible hand of the author or something? I feel like if we could have George as some kind of avatar, you'd be guaranteed to win because he's the one writing the tournament, presumably.
Well, George said if he could have anybody fight for him in a trial by combat, it would be somebody from Wild Cards or something who had like a mythical sword that would never break.
Well, does it have to be someone from Game of Thrones? One of my wildcard characters, like Lohengrin, my wildcard German knight who can conjure up a suit of absolutely invincible ghost steel armor and a ghost steel sword that can cut through anything by an act of will. That's his superpower. So he would make mincemeat of any one of the 7 kingdoms.
That's mighty boring. Back in the day, George did write a tournament between Jamie and Rand al'Thor from Wheel of Time for like an online competition.
Yeah,
that was pretty neat.
And then he also did the one later on for Jamie and Cthulhu.
Yeah.
In that same tournament.
Yes.
Which he sort of cheated on that one because Jamie slew a bunch of Cthulhu cultists, and that was the end of the tournament. So I'm not buying it, George.
That was what our tournament was based on for so many years.
He wins it because Tyrion tells him to go read a damn book.
That is very George in the story there, it seems like. So...
Guys, this is a very special episode in which we're really just trying to emulate the WWE Westeros, Essos. And, and Michael and I are tag teaming the episode. So round 1, you're going to get me, then I'm going to tag out, and you're going to get Michael.
Guys, I'll see you guys on the flippity flute.
So for our first subreddit highlight, we have from user Dr. Gruselglatz, Baghdad's House of Wisdom, historical parallel to the Citadel and a vision of its end. Too long didn't read of this one. The Citadel has quite a lot of parallels to the House of Wisdom medieval Baghdad, laying out the history of the House of Wisdom, which was sacked by the Mongols, and its book thrown into the Tigris. You can extend the parallels to Euron sacrificing the Citadel's writings to the drowned god in some kind of magical ritual. Roderick Harlaw might turn into a major hero by betraying Euron and attempting to save as many books as he can, mirroring a guy named Al-Tusi, allegedly doing the same during the siege of Baghdad.
It's a great post.
It's a great post.
It is. I like that it builds off of, previous theories of Oldtown being a parallel for the Library of Alexandria, which I still believe, but also throws in this other thing, how George R. R. Martin says that he doesn't take inspiration from just one place. He steals from ideas from a bunch of different places because that's what creativity is, and puts it all together to give it his own spin. And this does a great job of doing that. There's a lot of other interesting things like the Siege of Baghdad, where stories claim that the tigress was running black with ink and red with blood, to the way that Euron Greyjoy is described as being, of course, a squid with black ink and sailing on a sea of blood. So
I also think an interesting part of this post is they talk about what happens in Baghdad after this and how it sort of led to a collapse of knowledge. And if you start to think about A Song of Ice and Fire going forwards past the end of the story as we know it, eventually it will become the Age of Heroes for those people long in the future, assuming humanity survives. How long if we look at A Song of Ice and Fire and just the knowledge collapse they've had and the amount of technology they've lost, even from the Valyrians, and going back to Ashai, we could be in another cycle of 5,000 years before they get back to being a real civilization.
Yeah. And of course I like the focus on Roderick Harlaw. He's not an underrated character. He's a character that I think a lot of people have appreciated, his sort of quiet rebellion in some ways of Euron, and lines with dead history is written in ink, the living sort in blood, so tying it back to those themes of the sack of Baghdad's library, and just giving Roderick Harlaw a more substantial role in terms of betraying Euron. I like that idea.
I really like that little tie into this is what Melisandre is actually seeing in her visions. That's great, because so many of her visions are well, yeah, I suppose that could be what you think it is, but it just ties it so nicely together with I saw towers by the sea submerged beneath a black and bloody tide. Fantastic.
It would also fit with Melisandre always getting what she thinks is wrong. She thinks doesn't she think it's Eastwatch, and be great if it was accidentally the Citadel?
Well, Melisandre seeing Oldtown in her vision isn't a new idea. That idea has been around for quite a while. What happens is she lands up at Eastwatch and she has this vision of towers by the sea submerged beneath a black and bloody tide. That's where the heaviest blow will fall, as she says. And she realizes it doesn't look like Eastwatch, but she kind of convinces herself that it does, because that's the only thing that really fits in Melisandre's head at this point, because you've got her seeing there's going to be this fight against the Great Other, and it's going to take place with Stannis, and therefore it must be up at the wall, and so it has to be Eastwatch because nothing else really fits in her mind.
She just doesn't know enough about Westeros to be able to make that call, I guess, as someone who's new to the country. Or
at least hasn't been here for a long time, if you believe the theories about who her parents are.
Yeah.
Being Bloodraven and Melanie
Shaira
Seastar.
Shaira
Seastar. Yeah.
Well, it also has to deal with Mel's confirmation bias as well. She says the towers in her fire had been different, but that was oft the way with visions. The question is, does it even look like a city, what she's seeing? Because depending on your vantage point and who you are, and you're expecting to see what you want to believe, Melisandre even goes into this, people see what they want to believe, and that screws them up. Well, she's also falling into the exact same category as that. And we then rely on what Melisandre sees, because what if that's not even in towers at a city at all? What if that's a vision of people standing out in the tide of a sea that Euron is then drowning, but we can't properly interpret that because we have to go off of what she believes already, that it's towers and buildings by the sea. I don't know if George would do next level occlusion and stuff like that, but you also look at the vision that she has there where she sees Brandon Bloodraven also, and she even comments that he sees me. She sees that the people through the Werewood network are seeing her through this fire vision, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So if there's something going on with Euron and he's on Shade of the Evening, and that's somehow intertwined with her own fire visions because it's more LSD, crazy based, it could totally contort what her fire vision turns into the metaphorical. So I just question if that's even towers at all.
It could be multiple towers in that it's since it's Oldtown, it could be the literal towers of the library, and it could be the metaphorical ones of House Hightower. I don't know.
Well, presumably with the city line of Oldtown, it's just one big tower. It's not towers.
I'm looking back at a post from, it's ages ago, so I hope that's okay to talk about right now.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
Okay, cool. It's from September of 2015, actually, and it's from A Numbers.
Oh yeah.
A numbers.
Just read all the numbers aloud.
A 4187021 is the username.
I actually upvoted this I'm one of the 160 people.
You go, Aaron.
I'm so proud of myself.
He talks about Melisandre's visions, and he ties the towers she's seeing to Oldtown as well. But then there's a great comment in that post from Brash Endeavors.
Yeah.
There's apparently a place near Oldtown called the Three Towers. And but then I know, right? And then to go back to Roderick Harlaw, his castle is called the 10 Towers.
That's right.
Oh, damn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
The
from
Harlaw
Okay,
House
yeah.
Castle.
I don't really know if anybody sees Euron going back to the Iron Islands anytime soon, but you've also got like towers like kind of everywhere that are buildings. Like Elio of Westeros.org has pointed out the towers at Greenstone, and there's also the great towers at the temple at Volantis, which Volantis is mentioned by Tyrion as the entire city's kind of crumbling. They're also supposedly hiding books there as well inside the Great Walled portion of the city. It's just, it could be anywhere at this point. But running away from the towers for a second, because whatever. Is all the stuff about, like, Euron sacking a library maybe a bit too tropey?
I don't think it's a trope in that. So, he's foreshadowed it several times in that he's talked about in, like, the history of the library, how many times it's almost burned. It's almost burned down at least 2 times, maybe 3. And then considering how much George has been inspired by Julius Caesar, and even, like, says Julius Caesar is his favorite Shakespearean play. So when people question the purple eyes of the Targaryens, George likes to point towards Elizabeth Taylor and say that she had violet eyes. And if you watch Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal of Cleopatra, it is Daenerys. Like, that is who George modeled Daenerys after, like, especially in that first scene. Like, later scenes, maybe not as much, but there's no doubt in my mind that her personality is very much inspired by that performance. The burning of Alexandria is in some ways a big turning point in Caesar and Cleopatra's relationship, and I just think that George sees it as such a pivotal moment in history and sees the potential that it could have as, like, a pivotal moment for character development, etc.
Or if we follow that, would that make Euron Caesar and Daenerys Cleopatra?
I don't think it would be exactly quite like that. I think George sees himself a lot in characters like, I mean, he says he relates most to Sam, even though Tyrion's his favorite character. And as someone who loves books, something like the burning of a library and just considering all the knowledge lost, all we don't know now, when you think about it, like in our own real world, is just a tragedy for someone like that.
Next up is a fantastic post I personally enjoyed very much by the great user Lemon Peely, entitled On Theories, Tropes and Tinfoil. Inside this post, Lemon Peely refutes the all too present idea that George is concerned solely with twists, trope breaking, and subverting expectations. Instead, they link to that great time sink TV Tropes to demonstrate that the series is chock full of tropes, with many of them, played straight. They point out that a series without tropes would be, in their words, so abstract as to defy comprehension. Then they use this argument to point out that many thoughts and theories on the series don't really consider the context of the story itself outside the universe, and the way that Tinfoil, based purely on the idea that George is concerned only with subverting tropes, isn't quite in sync with the reality of how George writes of what he's doing.
Just because we're going to talk a lot about Julius Caesar, I'm going to talk about Julius Caesar again, right? We don't have to, but I'm gonna. Because when we're talking about subverting a trope, Ned dying isn't like 3/4 of the way into book 1, which is like originally meant to be not as early in the story because it was supposed to be a trilogy, isn't actually like, in some ways it feels like it's subverting a trope because we're presented we don't know what's going to happen to Ned Stark initially, and we're given his POV, so we feel like he's going to make it out. But if you think about it, Ned Stark is the Julius Caesar of the play that is A Song of Ice and Fire. You know, Julius Caesar, titular character of the play, dies in Act 3, and then the rest of the story is the war and like the aftermath afterwards. Here we have Robb Stark, and Robb Stark in many ways is the Mark Antony of the story. Falls in love, or not falls in love necessarily, but gets involved with the wrong woman and ends up losing the war and dies. The reason it works is because, same as it did in the play, in the story, these all have ramifications that all lead to other things happening in the story. They act as catalysts for this character development. Obviously, if we're given 4 or 5 POVs that are closely attached to Ned, Ned's death is going to have a huge effect on them as characters. George R. R. Martin doesn't do things just for the sake of it. He does things so that they'll have these effects on other characters, not just to say, gotcha!
Yeah, to build off that idea of putting Ned's death in the context of another story, as you did with Shakespeare, Ned is the mentor figure to the Stark children. He's the Obi-Wan, the Dumbledore figure that eventually dies, setting the stage for the younger characters to have their adventures. Jon and little Bran and all the other Starks are Luke Skywalker or Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Ned is another in a long line of fantasy mentors that die relatively early on in a story to kickstart younger characters' adventures.
Gandalf.
Yeah.
If anything, a lot of people get maybe thrown off because Ned's a lot younger than most of the characters we're used to dying in these kind of stories. He's like 30 or 40, something like that. A lot of times it's people that are graybeards or people like Gandalf and Obi-Wan, like you said, that are very old. So it's like, if you're looking for that character to die, well, then Ned would surprise you. But it's what you're saying in terms of the story structure, it's not actually a surprise it's just that he changed the details enough to trick people.
Well, it's kind of the old mentor does die at the very start. That's Jon Arryn.
It's mentors all the way down. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Everybody's just mentoring until the next generation dies.
But we have more time with Obi-Wan, and I guess that's what makes it a deconstruction, right? Because it's a deconstruction because A Song of Ice and Fire allows us to have the perspective of people such as these mentor figures that usually aren't the main character, or even in some ways like the villains, such as Cersei, or much later on how we change our perception of Jaime.
I also think that Lemon Peely's post is great, based on what Eliana said about what it means to characters. Like, if you come up with tinfoil, your tinfoil shouldn't exist just to, in a meta sense, like as you're developing your little theory, it should have ramifications for what it impacts as far as people are thinking and feeling and how it changes them. It shouldn't just be, okay, this happened and it's a crazy twist. Like, oh my god, the reader is so surprised. It's got to build around that and influence the rest of the story. So if you're looking for something that is super twisty and an exciting moment, it has to be very well developed as to like, okay, this is how it changes this character, and it bounces around, and this is how it will change the direction of this character based on the new decisions that they will now make based on that information.
I also think this is not an argument a lot of people like, but it's if the show is totally ignoring the part of the tinfoil that you think is hugely important to the story, it's probably not going to be true, because like we were talking about with Jeff in the Quill and Tankard, they are sort of going to the same place. So basic elements should still line up even if details change. If you're theorizing like a big overarching part of the story and they're completely ignoring it, that's maybe a sign that you found something cool that's probably not going to be true.
You can also use it as like certain theories that exist as examples. One that comes to mind is Howland Reed is the High Sparrow. Like, how exactly does that influence different characters in the story? And I'm struggling to figure out what that exactly changes. Like, if would that change anything that happens with Cersei or with Qyburn or anybody around there?
Like what Lemon Pilly says in the OP is, if this were true, what would it do for the story? That's, the idea.
Yeah.
And somewhere in the, this is expanded on more in the comments, but the idea of like George R. R. Martin doesn't do tropes, and I think it's a mistaken also like understanding also of like to some extent what tropes are, because I had a professor who once said, all stories start with tropes. That's like where stories start. And it's what makes a good story is what it does with the trope and how it goes beyond just the trope. You know, you're going to have these because they just reoccur in stories. As Dickens says, all good stories I've been told. That's not the verbatim quote, but it's close enough.
It's close.
Yeah.
It's like they're conflating tropes with cliches. They're not precisely the same thing.
Yes. I think
Yeah.
that's exactly it.
He hides the twists that he does in things you don't want to happen. And so you're actively, like, you don't want the Starks to all die because you're following them. You don't want Ned to die because you've gotten attached to him. So he takes what you're anticipating as a bad outcome and then just makes it happen. And that's what a lot of his twists sort of break down to being.
Well, when George does these things as well, the way that George goes about it is he has these characters who have clearly defined traits that lead down this path that is what you don't expect, but what you should expect. Like, the decisions that Robb makes ultimately lead to the Red Wedding, and it's the mindset of Walder Frey doesn't change since the Game of Thrones. By the time that he executes the Red Wedding, same thing with Tywin Lannister or with Ned and Joffrey. All these characters like are set up to make these events happen, but your like mind doesn't believe that it's going to occur. So that subverting the trope is really just following through on who that character is and how they feel, and leading it through like, oh, I should have felt this way the entire time.
So this post is from Try Another No, and it's called, I think D&D threw Daenerys' eventual fate in our face and nobody noticed. The visions in Dany's House of Undying on the show actually are prophecies, and they're not just a trick by the warlocks.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really neat because I remember that scene starts out with snow falling on a destroyed throne room in King's Landing. So she reaches out to touch the throne, but she stops just before she does it. What she realizes is that if she seizes the throne in this vision, she is doomed.
Doomed!
Doomed! Yes, indeed. I'm just going to read what he wrote because I thought it was great. What she doesn't realize is that this threat of her doom reaches beyond simply being inside the vision in the House of the Undying. The vision is symbolic. Whether she sits on the throne at the House of the Undying or she waits for the prophecy to be fulfilled and sits on the throne in the real King's Landing, she's doomed anyway. So this goes back to what we were talking a little bit about in the Quillen Tankard episode the other day, where Dany goes for King's Landing, and in the books is probably going to be fighting against Aegon, and in the show it looks like it's going to be Cersei and Jaime. So he was saying, you know, she's going to be tempted by the throne, pull back, and she's going to go where she really needs to go, which is the second vision in the House of the Undying series on the show, is the gate under Castle Black opening. Duty and destiny stop Daenerys from lingering in the throne room in the vision. Duty and destiny will stop Daenerys from lingering in the throne room at King's Landing. Daenerys is called to the next vision, just as she will be called to fulfill the next prophecy, which is to take the dragons north and defeat the others. She walks out and she sees the tent where Drogo died, where she went in with Mirri Maz Dor and the dark magic was done and Rhaego died.
The Nightlands. Interesting that the Nightlands also happen to be in the lands of the Night's King.
Whoa.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. So in the scene, she goes into the tent and she has a conversation with Drogo. He says in his post that the tent she sees in the blizzard symbolizes death.
It's an intense scene for sure.
Doomed.
Oh, doomed.
Sam, how do you do this?
Yeah, I'm impressed. He says in his post, though, that entering the tent is in the midst of the blizzard is in-your-face prophecy. So what he's saying is going to happen is that Dany is going to die fighting the White Walkers, and the whole thing, what sealed it for me was his ending, that it is not necessarily tied into the rest of it, although I thought the rest of it was great too. The last vision of Drogo and Rhaego in the tent was, he's saying that seeing Drogo and Rhaego in the tent is green seeing, essentially. That is really where Drogo and Rhaego, they really are waiting for her to ride into the Nightlands. And he says he continues to wait for her in the tent of death in the blizzard beyond the wall. And it was just so sad and poignant, but kind of nice too. And I just thought it was a really interesting interpretation of what that scene in the show was.
I really like that the OP Try Another No and this discussion in general, and it's kind of an underplayed thing, but it's taking the show and D&D on its own terms without any book purism. There's no arrogance or anything to this. It's just a very earnest, very fascinating, intelligent analysis of the scene without clouding it with any, negativity. It's very nice to see.
Yeah, no, George did this better kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to cloud it with negativity. Just wait.
And even just to refute a little bit of what you said with regard to why the show did it differently. And obviously I have no idea. But also they can't show a whole lot of that because it would give up the secret too soon if you blatantly show it. The same way that, we didn't know who it was talking in the Dragon Skull room in King's Landing with Arya.
That's very good point.
First season, it's Illyria, and they showed it and tried to hide it. And so, because they couldn't. And I think that that's probably what happened here, is that to keep things concise as well as to keep things a mystery, they did it the way they did it.
They also do this with R+L=J, where they've cut out a lot of the hints to Jon's parentage until very, very recently, because George hides a lot of things in just the amount of words he puts in there. There's too much to pay attention to. That's why our fan community exists. You put it on TV, everyone sees it, everyone's going to be thinking about it. There's nowhere to hide if you put all of Dany's visions in there. I also like something about this this post, and this is something that George does that the show actually does, is that the warlocks are they sort of don't really understand what they're doing. They get things wrong. They think they're in control and they're not. They do all this stuff to Dany in an attempt to trap her forever. She gets away in both of them. And I like the idea of this post where they're trying to show Dany some things, and then she accidentally gets something that they don't expect. They open up a door that they're not expecting, and she goes through it. That's a very cool interpretation of a scene that I didn't really think that much of when I saw it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the effect that this has in the show, and that I think Try Another No does a great job of showing in this post, is as opposed to focusing on necessarily looking at each of these different visions and what it's going to mean for the story, what ends up happening in that House of the Undying scene is it becomes solely about what Dany wants for herself and her character development, and showing, does she want the Iron Throne? Yes, she does, but how she goes against it so that she can get what she truly wants, how she even turns away family and has to just go forth alone.
In her internal POV from the books, she also does a similar thing where she's thinking about being Queen of Meereen, and she thinks back all I really want to be is running towards the house with the red door and playing in the street again. It's what she wants is peace and happiness, but she's playing the part of the Dragon Queen. Something
that I thought was great and that I hope was intentional is that so she doesn't touch the Iron Throne. She reaches out towards it and then pulls back, and then it goes to the next vision north of the wall. She does touch Rhaego. She kneels down and she sort of caresses him, and she touches Drogo. I thought that was a really great contrast. What she is maybe a visual representation of what she wants versus what she wants more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm gonna go back and throw a wrench at Try Another No and everything that we've discussed.
Oh boy.
And that's that from the meta of listening to enough interviews of Dan and Dave.
Oh no.
They've cited before that the whole reason why they did this scene is because they wanted to have Jason Momoa back more than anything. because they loved hanging out with him at bars. Like, at one time, he almost broke David Benioff's hands playing a game of slap like hands while they were drunk, and like Benioff had to go to the hospital for it. So they've cited before the reason they did this scene is because they were searching for any way to get Jason Momoa back and playing Drogo again, because he was so much fun to hang around off set. At least that's the reason that they've said off screen. So some of this stuff may be true, and they may have had input, because this was a time when they probably would have had more input from George.
Makes me think of how in season 1, so many of the best scenes were from the fact they made the episodes too short, and at the end they realized they needed some stuff to fill it out. It's like D&D, sometimes it's these things you can rightly point out as not the most noble causes for great scenes, but it can still end up in a great scene.
If you look back, like if you look at even people like Tolkien, who people revere, if you look at some of the reasons he did some of the things in his books, they're really stupid. He made like bets with C.S. Lewis, and he was just writing jokes back and forth, and people like revere them. They're like, oh my god, this is amazing storytelling. Like why they made that decision is less important than the outcome, I think.
I'd agree.
Yeah, I mean, and it could be both, too. You know, they wanted Jason Momoa to come back, but they also needed to show something pivotal with Dany. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. One doesn't have to be completely noble, artistic, and creative, while the other one is frat boys and bros in a bar. I mean, it could be both. It just happened that,
Frat bros.
you know, writing it one way would also get their friend to come back to the set,
and I mean,
too.
like, the way it plays out with stories in general is like,
Frat dog.
was Gatsby's green light something that Fitzgerald planned? Or was that symbolism just something that rose organically out of the story? And I think that you could argue that that happens here. And regardless, I think that it was a really emotional and well done scene. Alright, so every now and then our subreddit does some really cool things. That's a lie. We always do really cool things. Recently, one of those cool things was that we brought Adam Feldman, author of the Myronese Blot essays, to do an AMA on the subreddit. Some of his most famous essays include the Untangling the Myronese Knot essays, some of which touch on who poisoned the locusts, as well as the internal struggle of Daenerys in A Dance with Dragons. And what makes this series of essays, beyond being just a really great analysis of Daenerys' storyline, what makes this a great series of essays is that it was actually acknowledged by George R. R. Martin, who said that he felt that at least someone understood what he was trying to go for in Dance. But anyways, there's some really great discussion in this AMA. I would highly recommend checking it out. But do you guys have any thoughts about any of the responses or questions that happened in this AMA?
I thought one of the more interesting questions he got was if there was an extra POV in Marine, who would he choose? And he chose the Green Grace. And I think that's a very... I hadn't really thought about that before, and she would be an excellent character. George gives us Barristan, which is showing us Dany and Marine from a Westerosi perspective. But if you show us Dany Marine from a Myronese perspective, I think that's a lot. That would give you a lot more understanding of the character and what's going on in the Myronese blot and the knot that had to be pulled apart. It would solve a lot of the structural problems people have with the Marine plot by giving an extra perspective and showing us for her from the outside instead of from somebody who likes her.
Yeah, more Marine definitely would have endeared people to Dance.
I like Marine. There is kind of one concern that I would have with giving a Myronese point of view, and that's that George has somewhat struggled in painting Dany as a sympathetic character, at least to the larger reader base as a whole, where Feldman's AMA does a great job clearing that up. But if you have a Myronese point of view in there, especially when Dany is like seen as a foreign occupying ruler, it would not paint her in as much as the positive light, which would create even a greater problem that he has like getting this across to the reader base as a whole. But at the same time, like, I would like to see a Myronese point of view, because it's like a small version of a Game of Thrones, retold as like almost a reboot in some ways. But because we only get Dany and Barristan and like Quentin as point of views there, we don't really see it as good as a Game of Thrones was. We see it as fairly confusing rather than a really intricate storyline. So it would be nice to have Myronese point of views there.
Yeah. I do actually think more Miranese POVs, literally a non-zero amount of Miranese POVs, might have helped endear people to what was going on with the Miranese.
I'm only being half sarcastic. I do think it would have made the story work a lot better. And it would have been a fascinating opportunity for an SOC point of view, which I think the series sorely misses.
Yeah.
Except for Ario, isn't he? Because he's from a free city.
He's Norvoshi, which is technically the free cities are Essos, right?
Yeah.
Sort of.
One thing that George said about using Barristan in that is he needed a POV that knew the players but didn't know that much information as far as what was going around there, because he still wanted to hold things for the Winds of Winter as far as what's going on in that story. Who knows how that will work like now, many years later. But the Green Grace, provided she is not a harpy...
Yeah, the harpy.
Yeah, that would throw a lot of wrenches in theories that Glas Galere is the son of the harpy.
She would be the harpy itself.
Yeah, a lot of people believe that. And so if she ended up being the harpy and she was detailing you all the stuff that she was planning to do in her nefarious plots, would be, I would say, lame. So I agree with like Feldman that she's not, because you go through what Glas Galere says, everything that she does is actually to the benefit of Dany. Like, she's actually helping her when she's like, hey, you need to try and appease the people in Meereen if you want to be chill with their culture. Like, they're not going to back you unless you're doing these things like wearing your floppy ears and eating this cake, because there's like some wedding cake that she has to eat and all these other things. And that's actually crucially important. Like, you look at Iraq, and like, you have to embrace the local culture in order to get people to believe in you, because you're a foreign ruler in this sense. And she tries to help Dany. There's one point where she comes to talk to Dany about Dario. She waits outside all morning to bring this information to Dany. She's the first in line, and she says, I want to talk to you in private about all this stuff. The presumption of a certain sellsword. And Dany is like, the tragedy of Brown Ben Plum has shocked us all, because she like tries to reframe it in the context of, it's not Dario the sellsword, it's Brown Ben Plum. And so Dany flips that around on her, and it's basically a giant FU towards the Green Grace, who stayed outside all night, like trying to help her, and now she's just gonna throw her away. And she's like, Dany thinks internally like she's trying to shame me in front of my court, but no, she like wanted to talk to you about this in private. She didn't want to bring this out in front of everybody else. So I don't think that the Green Grace is really evil in the sense like that. I'm not sure George even intended her to be that much of a mystery, but because of Dany's point of view bias, we're led to not like her as much as we should.
But yeah, so the things that you're saying, Aaron, it's interesting because this subject is actually touched upon in this AMA to an extent. Like, so in the Miranese blot, Feldman very much agrees with your point of view that the Green Grace and her desire for peace in Meereen and perhaps compromise with Daenerys is earnest. And poor Quentin and perhaps Stephen Atwell, it seems, disagree with this point of view. They believe that, to quote, it's peace in the sense that the exploitive status quo will be once again undisturbed, but the lives of the slaves will not be peaceful. It's not a peace in the sense of harmony among mankind, a chance to plant trees. It's peace in the sense that the spice must flow. So when Barristan says that I would shatter that peace, that is a good thing, this is Reconstruction, and he's fighting the Ku Klux Klan. So
what?
I'm not gonna hash out the whole argument.
I don't know anything about David Duke.
Jeff asks Feldman his perspective on this, and Feldman continues to believe in the peace in Meereen that the Green Grace tries to broker with Dany is a real peace, and that the Green Grace and her tears at the pain that Meereen is experiencing are real tears, that she does feel all this. And then poor Quentin comes in, and then we have this very great discussion between all these different parties on what's going on with Meereen, what's going on with the Green Grace, perspectives on whether or not the peace was real and why. Everybody check it out.
It's a mess. It's a hot mess. Everybody check it out. I love it.
I think this is the fact that all this came out from an AMA about Feldman shows what a valuable contributor he is to this community, and the points he touches on it inspires such really strong opinions and different ways of looking at the story that it's important to have somebody that can articulate it for everyone else to have a discussion about.
Yeah, and it spurs that discussion. That seemed like a really great note to end on, Matt.
Woo!
I think you nailed it.
And I guess it's that time of the episode where you abandon us.
Also, I will sadly be leaving for the rest of the episode. Me and Eliana are going to go off. There's Pokemon. We got to go watch Pokemon.
All right. This is like when Misty and Brock leave after the first...
This is
the
correct.
First arc of Pokemon and the Kanto journey, so that's Matt leaving. Oh wait, Matt, are you Brock? Am I Misty?
We haven't decided this yet. We got to work this out in private.
Okay, you can be Misty if you want. All right, so goodbye, everyone.
I'm not going to admit that.
Togepi.
Oh my god, was that Aaron?
Yeah, it was.
Team Rocket, blast off at the speed of light, surrender now, or prepare to fight, or grab your Togepi and get the hell out of here. As Michael comes back for the unpopular opinion, Thunderdome.